What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. I figured that as we get closer to the NFL season, today I want to talk about some of the players that, for one way or another, have found themselves onto my Dynasty fantasy football teams. And these are the players that I have the most exposure to across all of my Dynasty fantasy football leagues. So these are essentially the players that are going to make or break my 2026 season when it comes to competing for championships and trying to win my own leagues. Now, one quick note is just because I have a ton of these players shares, it doesn't necessarily mean that I fully believe on these players being true difference makers for us in Dynasty Fantasy Football here this year. But we're going to talk about all of these guys here today. I have 7 players for us to talk about. So if this is your first time at the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. But without wasting any more time, let's talk about these players. All right, so the first player that I want to talk about here today is going to be quarterback Jaxson Dart for the New York Giants. Look, I drafted Dart in a lot of the late first and early second round picks last year in a lot of my leagues because he felt like he was such a great value for being a first round quarterback in Superflex leagues. He exceeded expectations as a rookie. He averaged 41 rushing yards per game, the 5th most by a rookie quarterback ever, and he also tied Drake May for 4th in fantasy points per dropback despite attempting just 3 passes to Malik Neighbors before the Neighbors injury. Now, obviously with Jaxson Dart, there's a lot of controversy about the way that he plays. His play style is kind of this ultimate risk versus reward type of play style. The same aggressiveness that creates those big fantasy weeks for us is also the same aggressiveness that ends up putting him in the medical tent. Now, there are still plenty of variables with Jaxson Dart going into his sophomore season, and we have seen some sophomore slumps over the last couple of years, guys like CJ Stroud, Jayden Daniels. But with this new coaching staff, I'm not as worried about Jaxson Dart because Dart is a young mobile quarterback in an ascending offense that should have their wide receiver 1 back here this year, and they do still have plenty of fantasy football upside. So while Jaxson Dart was kind of a value pick for me on a lot of these rosters, and he wasn't necessarily somebody that I was drafting to rely on, he has become one of those players for me, and I am looking at him going into the 2026 season as a low-end QB1, high-end QB2 option for me on a lot of these contending rosters. Now let's move on and talk about our next guy. It's going to be running back Jahmyr Gibbs for the Detroit Lions. Obviously, this is a guy that you love to have on a lot of rosters going into this season. He was one of my guys in the 2023 draft class. You can go back, you can check the receipts, you guys will find everything that you need to see, but all of my shares of Jahmyr Gibbs in Dynasty up to this point have come from drafting him as a rookie. And going into the 2026 season, he is my early pick for the fantasy football MVP. I think he's going to be the most valuable player in fantasy football here this year. Gibbs has scored the most touchdowns by any running back in NFL history through their first 3 seasons, and after Dan Campbell took over play calling in week 10 last year, Gibbs saw the biggest workload of his career. Now, with David Montgomery gone, the door is open for an even bigger, monstrous season from Jahmyr Gibbs. That's why I'm so in on him here this season. And you account for the fact that he is also a guy who just got paid this summer, becoming the highest paid running back here in the NFL. Now, obviously, it should go without saying, Jahmyr Gibbs is one of the most explosive, dominant fantasy football pieces, so I feel really good about going into the season with him on a lot of these rosters, and this is somebody that I'm definitely going to be relying on as we try and go win some championships. Now, let's talk about the first guy that maybe I'm not super in on for 2026, but I still like him long term. That's going to be running back Quinshon Judkins for the Cleveland Browns. I'm going into 2026 with more Judkins shares than I actually realized, but most of them kind of came early in the offseason when managers were still discounting him because of that 2025 injury. Now, obviously, that kind of puts me in an interesting spot because, like I said, I like the player and the price I paid, but I'm not overly confident in his ability to go out and produce here in 2026. Now, that said, Judkins should still have a true workhorse role after averaging 18.3 touches per game as a rookie and accounting for 34% of Cleveland's rushing attempts and targets. But that injury from last year does make his outlook very murky going into this season. He's practiced throughout the offseason, but after spending time ramping up, I still think he's a guy that we could see have a slow start before he kind of picks things up later in the year. You also add to the equation that Cleveland isn't really projected to be a very good offense, which adds another concern, I think, about his overall efficiency this season. So while I find myself with a lot of Quinshon Judkins on my team, and while I still view him as a top 12 dynasty running back, he's somebody that I'm not really confident in giving me top 12 type of production here this year, and I do expect him to be more of a mid to low end RB2 for me during this season and this season only. Let's move on and talk about some wide receivers. One of the first ones that I want to talk about is going to be wide receiver McConkey for the Los Angeles Chargers. Ladd is another player that I have on quite a few rosters because I was very high on him in the 2024 draft class. I drafted him as an early second round value and later traded the 104 for him in 2025 in another league just to add more shares to to my overall portfolio. And now I kind of have several teams that are going to be relying on McConkey as more of a weekly flex option behind some strong wide receiver rooms, which does make me feel pretty good about where I have him in those leagues. Now, obviously, his rookie season was awesome. He finished as the wide receiver 11 in fantasy, but he did take a step back in year 2. A big reason really was the regression against zone coverage and how much he was used out of the slot. So that's going to be worth watching in 2026 because new offensive coordinator Mike McDaniel does run a fast, motion-heavy offense, but he also likes to use a lot of 2 wide receiver sets with a fullback on the field. Now, on the positive side, Ladd reportedly dealt with injuries last season, and his passing offense should do a better job of creating mismatches and taking advantage of his route running ability, so it does indicate that there is a better probable chance at him seeing an uptick again here in year 3. That said, I'm not really sure he gets back up to that wide receiver 1 production that we saw from him as a rookie, but I do think he's a player who can give us that upside type of wide receiver 2 production, especially when you look across the target competition that he's going to be dealing with here, and it's going to be guys like Quinton Johnston, Trey Harris, Aronde Gadsden, David Njoku. I think there's a good opportunity here for Ladd McConkey to see that year 3 bounce back. One of the other players I'm going to be relying on is going to be wide receiver Josh Downs for the Indianapolis Colts. Downs is a player that I've always liked, but I never really had much exposure to him because he struggled to consistently get on the field in 2 wide receiver sets while Michael Pittman Jr. was a member of this team. However, the exposure that I had to Josh Downs started to change a little bit during the 2025 season when I had Downs getting thrown into several trades throughout the course of the year while he was injured and discounted at a pretty reasonable price tag for the most part. And now I find myself holding on to quite a few shares at a really good value. Now, I'd be lying if I said I haven't tried to shop some of these shares to kind of hedge my bet on Downs, but it does feel like the market is still a little bit cooler on Downs than I had expected, so I've mostly decided to hold on to a lot of these shares going into this season. And I'm comfortable with that because the combination of my low investment costs and the opportunity in front of him does give Downs plenty of upside to outperform these expectations. With Michael Pittman Jr. gone and Alec Pierce dealing with an ankle injury for most of the offseason, Downs could really enter the year as the Colts' primary wide receiver option, obviously probably behind a guy like Tyler Warren in the pecking order. Now, what this could mean for Downs is really what we've been wanting all along: more routes, more targets, and more importantly, more usage in those 2 wide receiver sets. And if that happens, I think Josh Downs has a really good chance to outperform those expectations, outperform his ADP, his current consensus value, and he should at minimum be a guy that can give you flex production on a week-by-week basis with a chance at having the ability to become a consistent wide receiver 3 for us on a week-by-week basis. The next wide receiver that I have a lot of exposure to is going to be wide receiver Jordan Addison here for the Minnesota Vikings. Addison was my wide receiver 2 in the 2023 rookie class, and I drafted a lot of him, especially after my Vikings took him in the NFL draft, and I'll admit the fandom of the Vikings probably did creep into my Dynasty rosters a little bit there, but that said, I think Addison is being overlooked in Dynasty right now. Minnesota's offense took a big step back last offseason compared to what we were used to seeing under Kevin O'Connell here with the Vikes. The inconsistent quarterback play hurt the entire wide receiver room, not just Justin Jefferson, and now the Vikings enter the 2026 season with Kyler Murray at quarterback, which should raise the weekly ceiling of this offense. Jefferson's value has already bounced back, but Addison's really hasn't, and that's where I think there's an opportunity here. Now, obviously, his ceiling will always be capped to some degree by playing alongside a guy like Jefferson, but we've already seen Addison produce as a wide receiver 2, especially when things are going well for this offense. Not to mention, Minnesota has already picked up his 5th-year option, so he's going to be under contract here for the next 2 seasons. So this is just a player who finds himself on a lot of my teams, 1, probably because of the fandom, but 2, because of the belief that if this offense bounces back and you're looking for ways to invest in this offense not named Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison feels like a solid, low-risk investment here in this offense that has the ability to be a high-end flex play and at minimum give us those boom weeks that we've seen from him here in the past. And now let's talk about the last player here in today's video. It's another wide receiver. It's going to be wide receiver Jayden Reed for the Green Bay Packers. Admittedly, I've kind of been a Jayden Reed truther almost to a fault over the last couple of years, holding on to him on a lot of rosters because I still believe in the talent despite not getting the opportunity. And we've seen the flashes with a few big games every season, but he's never really been a full-time player in this Packers offense, and that's kind of always been the issue. But maybe 2026 is finally the year that changes. Romeo Doubs is in New England, Dontavion Wicks is in Philadelphia, Matthew Golden's coming off of a disappointing rookie season and still needs to prove himself at the NFL level, and Jayden Reed also just got paid by this front office here this offseason. Not to mention Tucker Kraft also could be getting eased back into this offense after an ACL tear, which could create even more opportunity early on in the year for a guy like Reed. Now at this point, there's definitely some wishful thinking still involved in this type of process, but the path to the breakout is clearer than it has ever been for a guy like Jayden Reed. And if Reed finally gets a full-time role, he does have the talent to become one of the better post-hype sleepers in fantasy football. So that said, I am going into this season with Jayden Reed kind of looking at it as now or never for him. But if the breakout does finally happen, Jayden Reed is one of those cheap, affordable profiles that could be a swing factor in your odds of going out and winning your fantasy football league. So there you have it, folks. There are 7 players that I find on a lot of my Dynasty fantasy football teams right now, whether I realized it or not, or whether I believe in them fully or not. These are the guys that are going to make or break my 2026 season. Let me know, who are your make or break players here this year in the comments down below. If you liked today's video, hit the subscribe button. Also, if you found something informative, entertaining, and or actionable, do me the favor and hit that like button and go join our free Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description, helping you guys with those Dynasty fantasy football teams 24/7, 365. But with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.